Hi, my name is Sumant Kumar from Some Thoughts Online, and today I will be talking about the third part of the rise of nationalism in Europe. This is the third part in a three-part series, so if you haven't already checked out the first two videos, I would recommend that you go back to those videos first and then come back to this one so that you will get a better understanding. Remember, this is the first chapter in the history textbook for 10th standard CBSE students. If you haven't checked out those videos, I have links in the description below and you can use them. Get there, check those out, and then you can come back to this one. We're going to begin this chapter with the creation of modern day Italy. If you've gone through the previous videos, you will remember that Italy had been divided into various different kingdoms, duchies, and various small regions. We will be learning about these divisions in a little more detail in this chapter. In Italy, the Italian-speaking people were scattered over several dynastic states as well as the multinational Habsburg Empire. During the mid-19th century, Italy was divided into 7 states. The northern part of Italy was under the Austrian Habsburg Empire. The central region was ruled by the Pope and it was called the Papal States. The southern regions were under the Bourbon kings of Spain. Only one region, namely Sardinia-Piedmont, which was in the northwestern part of Italy, was under an Italian king. Even the Italian language had not acquired one common form and still had many regional and local variations. The modern Italy that we know of today did not exist during the 19th century. There were several small kingdoms and regions within the country, and they used to have small petty fights also with each other. Even the language was not common. The Italian language that they spoke was not really a common language throughout the entire region. You will remember from the previous chapters that Giuseppe Mazzini had sought to unify the Italian Republic. He had also formed a secret society called Young Italy to achieve his goals. However, the revolutionary uprising in both 1830 and 1848 had failed. Thus, the task of reunification fell on Sardinia-Piedmont and its ruler, King Victor Emmanuel II. In the eyes of the ruling class elites of this region, a unified Italy offered them the possibility of economic development and political dominance. Thus, the educated people of Italy had realized that a unified nation would be better for the economy and it would make them stronger if the people of Italy were unified. This unification of the entire nation would require them to fight against the other kings and the other dukes and the other local lords who governed the small regions in Italy. And this is where we are introduced to some new heroes in this freedom struggle. Chief Minister Cavour led the movement to unify the regions of Italy. He was neither a revolutionary nor was he a democrat. He was in fact a wealthy elite who spoke French much better than he did Italian. Through a diplomatic alliance with France, Sardinia-Piedmont defeated the Austrian forces in 1859. Apart from the regular troops, a large number of armed volunteers under the leadership of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a freedom fighter, also supported the army. In 1860, they marched into southern Italy and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and they won the support of the local peasants who helped them in defeating the Spanish. In 1861, Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed the king of a united Italy. However, much of the Italian population, just like the European population, were illiterate and they remained unaware of the liberal nationalist ideology. Most of Italy was unified by the combined efforts of Cavour and Giuseppe Garibaldi. Cavour then became the Prime Minister of the United Italy. Even though Cavour and Garibaldi had many differences amongst themselves, they were the greatest contributors to Italian unification along with Giuseppe Mazzini. We will now be learning about the situation in Great Britain and the unique way in which Great Britain came to be a nation state. In Britain, the nation state was not formed through revolution or social upheaval. The emergence of Great Britain as a nation state was the result of a long drawn-out process. There was no British nation prior to the 18th century. There existed 4 primary ethnic groups that inhabited the British Isles. These ethnic groups were the English from England, the Welsh from Wales, the Scots from Scotland, and the Irish from Ireland. The 4 ethnic groups on the British Isles had different cultures and different identities. England, however, began to gain more wealth and power after industrialization. They used this power to dominate the other 3 ethnic groups namely the Welsh, Scots, and Irish, and they managed to completely drive out their culture and their languages. The English Parliament had seized power from the monarchy in 1688 at the end of a long conflict, and through it, the nation state was formed with England at its centre. The Act of Union of 1707 between England and Scotland resulted in the formation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and in effect, England was able to impose its influence over Scotland. The British Parliament was dominated by its English members, and the growth of a British identity meant that Scotland's unique culture and political institutions were completely suppressed. The Catholic clans that inhabited the Scottish Highlands suffered terrible repression whenever they tried to assert their independence. The Scottish Highlanders were forbidden to speak their Gaelic language or wear their national dress, and large numbers were driven out of their homeland by force. The British Empire conquered many nations, including India, during the 18th and 19th century. This section of the chapter tells us about how the first few areas that they conquered were the British Islands themselves, where the people of Scotland and the people of Ireland were made to suffer terribly. England was a Protestant Christian nation, and they had major issues with their Catholic neighbours. Scotland and Ireland were both Catholic nations. They would support Protestants in other regions and help them win fights against the Catholics. Ireland also suffered a similar fate as Scotland. It was a country deeply divided between the Catholics and the Protestants. The English helped the Protestants of Ireland to establish their dominance over a largely Catholic country. Catholic revolts against British dominance were suppressed. After a failed revolt by Wolfe Tone and his United Irishmen in 1798, Ireland was forcibly incorporated into the United Kingdom in 1801. The symbols of the new British Empire were the British flag, called the Union Jack, the national anthem, which is God Save Our Noble King, and the English language. These were actively promoted, and the older nations survived only as subordinate partners in this union. The British Islands were completely under England's control after 1801. This led to many issues throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. And some of these issues between England and Scotland even continue to this day. This section of the chapter shows us that popular revolt is not the only way in which a nation state can be formed. Britain formed its own nation state using its industrialized military, its diplomacy, and the harsh subjugation or oppression of its neighbors' cultures. This was a long process that occurred over 100 years, but it's a very unique case in the formation of nations. We will now be moving on to the next section of this chapter, namely visualizing the nation. This section will deal with the personification of complex ideas such as liberty and justice, as well as the personification of the nation itself to create a sense of unity among the people. When an abstract idea such as liberty or justice is expressed through a person or a thing, it is called an allegory. Allegorical stories have two meanings, one which is literary and the other which is symbolic. Artists in the 18th and 19th centuries began to personify nations. They represented a country as if it were a person. Nations were often portrayed as female figures. The female form that was chosen to personify the nation did not represent any woman in real life. It sought to give the abstract idea of the nation a concrete form. That is, the female figure itself became an allegory of the nation. It is very difficult to communicate abstract ideas to the general public. Artists had to use creative ways to communicate such ideas. The use of allegories or human forms to express ideas was widely practiced in Europe. Concepts such as justice, liberty, and republic were all personified in female form so that the general public could identify with these concepts. I'm sure that everyone has seen the blindfolded statue of justice, which has the weighing scales in one hand and the sword in the other hand. It is a very common allegory that we see in our daily lives. We'll now be looking at how countries themselves in Europe were personified by artists using such allegorical figures. Female allegories were invented by artists in the 19th century to represent the nation. In France, this female allegory was called Marianne, which was a popular Christian name and underlined the idea of a people's nation. Her characteristics were drawn from those of liberty and the republic. She had a red cap, she had a tricolor around her, and she had a cockade, which was a common feature of all French citizens at that time. Statues of Marianne were erected in public squares to remind the people of the national symbol of unity and to persuade them to identify with it. Marianne images were also marked on coins and on stamps. Marianne is a popular figure in France. Many statues of her have been put up in public places to remind the people to follow her ideals. Even though Marianne is not a real person, the idea of a person representing a nation made it easier to communicate complex ideas to the uneducated public. And the uneducated public, as you know, formed the majority of the population at this time in Europe. Similar to Marianne, Germania became the allegory of the German nation. Let's try to understand what the different parts of the image given over here mean. The broken chains that you see symbolize being freed. Her breastplate with the eagle on it symbolizes the German Empire itself. It's a very popular symbol of the German Empire. The crown of oak leaves that she wears on her head is a sign of heroism. The sword in her right hand symbolizes a readiness to fight, and the olive branch around the sword symbolizes a willingness to make peace as well. The black, red and gold tricolour flag was the flag of the liberal nationalists in 1848, and the rays of the rising sun behind her signify the beginning of a new era. Many artists used popular symbols such as their national flag, a sword or their national emblem to communicate their abstract ideas in a better manner. Here we see that many such ideas need to come together to form the basic ideology of a nation. Even in India, we have the image of Bharat Mata, which invokes a sense of pride among all the citizens of India. Thus, allegories have been used for a long period of time to better understand certain abstract ideas. We will now be moving on and we will be studying about the nationalism in the late 19th century and its connection with imperialism. Nationalism moved away from its liberal, middle class ideology during the late 19th century, and it was instead used by the ruling class to justify their aggression against people belonging to other ethnic groups. In this section, the first concept that we must learn about is imperialism. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power through colonization or the use of military force. By the end of the 19th century, the idea of nationalism no longer retained its idealistic, liberal democratic sentiments of the first half of the century. It had now become a narrow ideology with very limited ends. During this period, nationalist groups became increasingly intolerant of each other and ever ready to go to war with each other. The major European powers in turn manipulated the nationalist aspirations of the subject peoples in Europe to further their own imperialist aims. Thus, rulers who wished to gain power for themselves began to use nationalistic sentiments in order to pursue their own goals. Nationalism, as you will remember, started out as a liberal ideology which was used to unite people and to overthrow the absolutist rulers of Europe. However, now this same nationalism was being used by the ruling class to create larger empires within Europe. Imperialism is a policy of expanding territory by taking over other nations, and this was widely practiced by the European nations during the 18th and 19th centuries. Even India was a colony of the British as they used the policy of imperialism to further their ends. We will now be studying about the Balkan region and about how the growth of nationalism made a huge impact over there. The most serious source of nationalist tension in Europe after 1871 was in the area called the Balkans. The Balkans was a region of geographical and ethnic variation comprising many modern-day nations such as Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, Macedonia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slovenia, Serbia and Montenegro. The inhabitants of this region are collectively known as the Slavs. The Balkan region had a great amount of diversity as people from different ethnic groups lived there. The Slavs were a group of people who were extremely proud of their ethnic identity, and they began to use nationalist sentiments in order to create a unified and united territory for themselves. Unfortunately, they were not successful as other European nations wished to colonize their territory for themselves. We will now be learning about how the Balkan region became a very explosive and dangerous place during the late 19th century. a large part of the Balkans was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The spread of the ideas of romantic nationalism in the Balkans, together with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, made this region very dangerous. All through the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had sought to strengthen itself through modernization and internal reforms, but it was very unsuccessful. One by one, its European subject nationalities broke away from its control and declared their independence. The Balkan peoples based their claims for independence or political rights on nationality and used history to prove that they had once been independent but had subsequently been subjugated by foreign powers. Hence, the rebellious nationalities in the Balkans thought of their struggles as an attempt to win back their long lost independence. It is important to study about the Balkan region because this was the most volatile region of Europe in the late 19th century. The people of this region had lived under the Muslim Ottoman Empire for a very long period of time. Once the ideas of nationalism began to spread in the Balkan region, the people wished to break away and form their own nations based on liberty and equality. This was not successful and it made the region a very explosive place, like I said. We will now see how the events in this region led to the period of World War I eventually. As the different Slavic nations continued to define their identity and independence, the Balkan area became an area of intense conflict. The Balkan states were fiercely jealous of each other and each hoped to gain more territory at the expense of each other. However, the Balkan region also became even more violent because it was the stage for a massive power rivalry between the large Western European nations like Germany and France and Russia. During this period, there was intense rivalry among the European powers over many policies, including trade, colonies, naval activities, and military power. The Balkan region was already experiencing the wave of nationalism that had begun in Western Europe in the late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Thus, it became a very violent place, as always happens when people are experiencing waves of nationalism. Along with this, the large European powers like France and Britain and Germany and Russia also tried to use that region to gain more territory for themselves and for their own empires. This proved to be a very bad decision because it led to many wars and many small fights in the region, and it eventually culminated in World War I. In relation to this, we will now be studying about some of the drawbacks of imperialism. Nationalism along with imperialism led Europe to World War I in 1914. Meanwhile, many countries in the world which had been colonized by the European powers in the 19th century began to oppose imperial domination. The anti-imperial movements that developed everywhere, including in India, had many common features. First of all, they were nationalist in nature, as they all struggled to form independent nation states. They were inspired by a sense of collective national unity. And they were forged in confrontation with imperialism, as in they were forged against imperialism. European ideas of nationalism were not replicated anywhere, as people developed their own specific variety of nationalism. The idea that society should be organized into nation states came to be accepted as natural and universal. Thus, nationalism and imperialism could not go hand in hand for a very long time. Many colonies of European powers, such as India, began to use nationalism to inspire the local people and to oppose imperialism. In the 20th century, there were many upheavals around the world, which led to the formation of many of the modern nations that we know of today. The idea of nationalism had begun as a liberal thought to unify people into nation states in Europe. It was now being used to break free from the oppressive empires and rulers all around the world. And with this, we come to an end to the first chapter in the history textbook. So thank you so much for watching. Today, we learned about the formation of Italy and the leaders who fought for its unification. We also learned about the emergence of Great Britain and the use of nationalism to oppress people belonging to different regions or ethnic groups. We learned about allegories and the visualization of abstract ideas by portraying them in human form. This personification can be used for ideas such as nations as well. We touched upon the topics of nationalism and the policy of imperialism, which cannot go hand in hand with each other because nationalism and imperialism are not really ideas which work well together. We learnt about the Balkan region and about how the seeds for World War I were sown there as a result of imperialist threats from the Western European nations. This concludes, like I said, the first chapter in the history textbook. In my next set of videos, I will be talking about nationalism in India, which is the second chapter in this section. Once again, I have been Sumant Kumar from Some Thoughts Online, and if you thought that this video was useful, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. If you have any doubts or questions, you can leave them in the comments below. Once again, thank you so much for watching.